In 1996, when he was 22 years old, Stephen left Kenya and went to work in Saudi Arabia. The plan was to make some money, save up, and go to college in America. He, however, found his niche in Saudi Arabia and decided to stick around. He found work as a warehouse manager at a tourist resort. However, an altercation with a Yemen colleague in 2011 would change his life forever. Hi, my name is Naomi Ngendo. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's get into it. So on 9th April 2011, Stephen was attacked and stabbed with a letter opener by Abdullahim, who was a Yemen citizen and who was also a colleague and his friend. Stephen was stabbed on his thigh and on his thumb.
It was salary related. I was supposed to go and collect my salary. But he was like, not willing to let me go. So I ended up getting angry, and then he used words that were not very good, and I could not take them. So we started a fight, and actually he's the one that started it, actually, because I have a stab wound on my hand and on my thigh. So that's how it went about.
In self-defense, Stephen took the letter opener and stabbed Abdullahim. There was some stabbing which was not intentional, Stephen later said.
The main cause of his death was actually not from the stabbing, from the wound. The doctor's report says that he delayed to go to hospital, so he lost a lot of blood. So it was just by mistake.
Yeah.
So in today's story, we'll talk about Stephen, of course, but we'll also talk about his mom, who has been relentless in her efforts to save her son's life. We'll be going back and forth between what was going on with Stephen in Saudi Arabia and what was going on back at home with his family in Kenya. The mom is Dorothy Kweyu. So initially she had heard that Stephen was the one who had been stabbed to death during the altercation, and she was uncontrollable. Then she learned that it was actually one of his workmates who had been killed, and she was still in distress. Her son had not been killed, but she would lose him anyway if he got executed by the sword. Saudi Arabia is the only country that still executes by the sword, which is decapitation using a sword. The family was in despair. They were already mourning the death of a lady who was married to one of Dorothy's sons. She had died due to postpartum complications, and now Dorothy's firstborn son would be executed in Saudi Arabia. Back in Saudi Arabia, Stephen went to trial and was sentenced to 5 years behind bars for manslaughter. This was back in 2011. The family was relieved when they heard the news. Stephen was willing to serve time and start afresh once his sentence was over. This means I could have been out of jail at least by the time I was hitting 40. Life, some say, begin at 40, and I was ready to begin mine on a new slate, Stephen said in a letter he sent from jail in Saudi Arabia. Then things took a turn for the worse. The family of Abdul Halim appealed the sentence before a Sharia court in 2014. Sharia courts usually apply Islamic laws, which are called Sharia, to resolve legal disputes. The 2011 ruling was overturned and Stephen was to be executed on May 15, 2024. The execution would have happened earlier, but Abdul Halim's youngest child was 5 years old when the dad died, and the child had to be 18 years old to give consent for Stephen's execution. So since 2014, Stephen had been on death row basically, and during that period, negotiations started. Abdul Halim's family were not budging on the other options, which are either forgiveness or payment of diya, which is blood money given to compensate a victim or their family. They were set on having Stephen executed. Dorothy was in distress, but she could understand why the widow and the family rejected the blood money. No money can compensate for the loss of a husband, a father, or basically any life. Abdul Halim's family did finally accept diya as payment after intense negotiations. Initially, Dorothy was to pay 400 million Kenya shillings, but the amount was negotiated down to 150 million Kenyan shillings. It was time for Dorothy and her family to start raising the money, which was not going to be an easy task. Most Kenyans never make this amount of money in a lifetime, and now Dorothy had to find a way to raise the money with a deadline that had been set to May 15, 2024. If they failed to raise the money, Stephen would be executed. Dorothy went to the media and pleaded with Kenyans. She pleaded with anybody who had her cry to help her raise the money to save her son's life.
We are in grave danger of losing my son. He's a Kenyan citizen. Can they kindly spare whatever they can to help us bring back Steve to Kenya? He has already been behind bars for more than 13 years.
So, thanks to Kenyans and well wishers all over, the family managed to raise 20 million Kenyan shillings. They were very grateful, but the money was still not enough to facilitate Stephen's release. Dorothy did not give up, and finally, she had the news that made her roll on the floor, according to Dorothy. On 27th March, on 27th March, it was announced that negotiations had been successful and Stephen would finally be reunited with his family. 129.5 million shillings was paid thanks to the government and the Muslim World League.
The Muslim World League had paid a 1 million US dollars in blood money that was demanded by the victim's family in order to save our brother Stephen Munyaho from execution for the manslaughter conviction 13 years ago. When Steve's mother made a public appeal last year and indeed visited our offices, the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims took up the matter and started engaging a number of his partners in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was observed that Steve never intended to kill the victim, given that he and the victim were in fact good friends, save for the unfortunate fight that led to the victim's death.
The family was not expecting this. The Muslim World League is an international independent organization whose mission is to clarify the true image of Islam and foster friendship among people. They operate through various global initiatives and they engage with governments and religious institutions to advocate for policies and promote coexistence and mutual respect among diverse communities. And I'm happy to announce that on July 29th, 2025, after spending 14 years in prison in Saudi Arabia, 50-year-old Stephen returned home a free man. He was received by friends, family, and supporters. The family's relentless campaign to bring their son home led to this moment. Stephen back in their arms.
It's wonderful to be back home. I'm so saturated, and indeed, I need a rest.
Stephen spoke up publicly for the first time in an interview, recounting the fight that led to his incarceration. I have never ever thought someone could die in my hands. We happened to have a misunderstanding, and it was my first fight in my life. I was known to be a peacemaker, and my mother can testify, he explained. And that is the story of the Kenyan man who was to be executed by the sword in Saudi Arabia and the efforts it took to save his life. Thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate you being here, and I would love to see you on my next one. Bye.
I'm so grateful you opened your door, wiped away my tears, and promised that you would deliver my firstborn, the first fruit of my womb.